Bandit upheavals, racketeering, separatism, the lawlessness of law enforcement. This is just a small part of the dark history of the city, which perhaps more than any other in Ukraine is associated with crime. Donetsk? Sit down more comfortably, dear ones, because what happened there and what eventually affected Ukraine today, it's really scary.
There is even audio information where representatives from Ukraine, so to speak, are discussing with representatives from Russia about Rinat Akhmetov's participation in the state coup in Ukraine.
DTEK company had a turnover of 54 billion in the first half of the year, despite buying coal for 600 hryvnias per ton in Vardlo and selling it for 1,700 in Rotterdam plus, resulting in a 200% profit.
Indeed, Rinat Akhmetov, a significant figure not only in Donetsk's history, but all of Ukraine. He has been in the status of the richest person for over 10 years, and even a full-scale war did not take away this position from him. I want to note that after all, the oligarch has lost significant assets. At the same time, Akhmetov is probably the most mysterious figure in the history of modern Ukraine. And the question about his role in the development of the war in Ukraine, which started in 2014, is still relevant.
For me, the biggest sanction is when I can't walk on this homeland, on my own, on the land of Donetsk.
I won't talk about where and how Akhmetov's childhood passed, because even if I wanted to, there simply aren't enough true facts available. At least not in the public domain. Generally speaking, it seems that Akhmetov was born as a person in 1966, but as a businessman and a public figure, he emerged in 1996 when he became the president of the football club Shakhtar. What he was doing for all 30 years before that is a good question. And obviously, a person from the street can't just become the president of a football club. This requires millions of dollars. For years, Akhmetov promised, pouring money into it. There were only rumors and assumptions about where he made his first fortunes. For example, Serhiy Taruta, a business partner and friend of Akhmetov, said that he made his first capital by playing cards.
He was one of the 5 or 6 best card players in the Soviet Union and went to competitions.
Only in 2022 did Akhmetov himself talk about this.
To be honest, I made my initial capital playing cards. It taught me a lot about tactics and strategy, analytical mindset, practical approach, and ability to adapt.
Cards are cards, and it happened. Perhaps there was more to them. Then I allow myself to voice another theory, which has no confirmation and seems to be just a rumor among people who claim to know Akhmetova personally. The essence of the theory comes down to the criminal. The idea is that in his youth, Akhmetov made money not only by playing cards, but also through involvement in criminal activities. After this information was published in the media, Akhmetov filed a lawsuit to the London court. He confronted the businessman, calling the published information slanderous. And all because it is impossible to either confirm or refute it. Such information can include that, according to which Akhmetov was allegedly among the bandits in 1986 who attacked a manufacturing base with smoke and skins. The information was spread by the Grand Plus A edition, and then it appeared in the Ukrainian Pravda. A man who was allegedly a victim of the attack was a foreman, so in Soviet times they called subordinate employees, and the gang wanted to turn him into stolen from the state 50,000 rubles. And this is quite a large amount for those years. However, the man resisted, saying that he had no money. Then they did not believe him. The bandits brutally achieved their goal until the victim died. The wife paid for the funeral. She gave the attackers the valuables. When later the defenders caught one of the participants in the attack named Leonid Yurchenko, he identified the recipients with whom they attacked the foreman. Among those names was Rinat Akhmetov, but he never showed up for the reward. Moreover, later Yurchenko retracted his words, and the gang of the foreman was never found. The police simply did not bother to investigate other suspects. The media attributed all this to the fact that someone from the Gorlovka police department was fond of playing cards with Rinat. They got scared and came to their senses. Even Rinat Leonidovich himself recently denied such allegations.
I have never been involved in any criminal organizations. I have never been persecuted by law, and no criminal charges have ever been brought against me.
I, for one, am not just saying that a lot of what has been said and will be said is speculation. You see, Rinat Leonidovich often reacts very sharply to negative rumors about himself and likes to confront those who spread these rumors. One of such speculations is that, allegedly, Akhmetov was in a gang of a criminal authority from Donetsk, Ahat Bragin, or Ahat. Ahat and over time he even became his right hand. And it seems that Bragin himself chose Akhmetov as partners for the hryvnia. You didn't think these were ordinary miners from the mine, did you? People in suits sat behind the counter with Rinat, like some kind of trade or party bosses. Moreover, they wrote that Akhmetov was directly involved in the death of Bragin. The evil tongues explained their absence by the fact that Akhmetov took over the presidency at Shakhtar after the previous club owner died. That same Akhmet Bragin, he was simply blown up at the stadium where Shakhtar played in 1995. Such is Donetsk. Incidentally, Akhmetov attended the match but lingered near the car for unknown reasons. So he didn't suffer from the explosion. Then according to Akhmetov's version, this is
nonsense, and such nonsense causes me great pain. My request was recorded for a match in 5 minutes, and he, not waiting for me, ran from the car to the stadium. The interval was exactly 5 seconds, no more. The horn honked as soon as I closed the car door. When your best friend dies in front of you, you realize that death is delayed by 5 seconds.
There are rumors in the media that after Bragin's death, a part of his fortune went straight to Akhmetov. Part of the assets of businessman Yevgen Shcheban also went to Akhmetov. More about this story in the video dedicated to Yanukovych next. But I will just mention that when Shcheban was shot at the Donetsk airport, Akhmetov received the Gefest company, the crown jewel of the Kartsysk pipe plant, and a company that later became known as Life. Akhmetov's partner, Sergei Taruta, received a portion of another company, the Industrial Union of Donbass. That's how it happened. What else did Akhmetov do? Well, he started his own bank to service the financial flows of his enterprises. And of course, he bought one by one industrial assets that were mostly related to coal mining and steel production. These were the times of active privatization, which began during the Kuchma presidency, and to which he has many questions. Even state enterprises were received by businessmen for nothing. Akhmetov himself posed as a real hero, as he literally saved factories from bankruptcy because he bought almost launched enterprises, which everyone was afraid of. Well, such a blessing led to the fact that by the mid-2000s, Akhmetov dominated in the steel and energy sectors of Ukraine. In addition, he had significant assets in agriculture, the transport sector, media, and others. Moreover, he founded the company System Capital Management. Under the control of this company went Avdiivka coke and chemical plant, Azovstal, Kartsysk pipe plant, Yenakiiv steel plant, and other industrial assets. On the surface, everything seemed decent and legal. What's wrong with the fact that in Donbass an unpleasant person has become a solid businessman? And in principle nothing, but in the mid-2000s a problem arose for Akhmetov. In 2005, the Lux company, which was based in a single hotel that he, so to speak, received after the business partner and friend Bragin was killed, came under scrutiny. Moreover, this was said very, very softly. Yuri Lutsenko, the current head of the Ministry of Internal Affairs, ordered the visit to Akhmetov's company, citing 2 reasons for the decision. The first is economic, evasion of tax payments and abuse of official position. The second is criminal.
The police responded to the alleged visits of the head of the coal group to the territory of Donetsk firms, including Lux Company.
I'll mention the first reason in a minute, because it's quite serious and urgent, but the second one seems extremely tricky. The point is that in Lux, which belonged to Akhmetov, they were looking for someone like Givi Nemsadze. This man was considered Akhmetov's right hand. They wrote that the gang controlled the gaming business in Donbass, the metal market, as well as the subsidiary factories for the production of alcoholic beverages. And yet, the Nemtsov gang was the fighting wing of the Lux criminal group on which Akhmetov stood. Nemsadze's people dealt with those subordinates who bothered Rinat, or whose business he wanted to take over. The Givi Nemsadze gang was involved in 57 killings in Donbass in the 90s, and also at the beginning of the 2000s, 25 of those killed by them were businessmen. They were killed to expand their influence or to take over the victim's business. 19 people were members of rival gangs, who were eliminated in order to expand their criminal spheres of influence. And 8 more, these are members of Nemtsov's gang, who were killed out of self-interest. Gangs. And 5 deaths. These are accidental witnesses. The gang became known when 22 bodies were found. 17 in the mine in the Starobyshevo district of Donetsk, and another 5 in the village near Donetsk. Shortly after this, almost 10 members of the group were detained. But how many people, including Nemtsov, were involved? Authorities searched for Nemsadze in Luxembourg, suspecting Akhmetov's freedom was linked to the formation of a bandit headquarters. The bandits' weapon was collected even on Lux's territory. All this happened less than 2 months after the acting head of the main department for combating organized crime of the Ministry of Internal Affairs, Sergei Kornich, announced that Rinat Akhmetov is the leader of an organized criminal group.
I am deeply convinced that Akhmetov is the real leader of the organized criminal group. Let him not be angry with me.
At the same time, journalists clarified whether they provide evidence of the businessman's involvement in the criminal world, collected materials about him. And Kornich said exactly, but all this matter went nowhere? Nothing criminal was found during the search in Lux. Akhmetov was released on bail. And then the case against Nemsadze just fell apart. In the summer of 2010, when Yanukovych came to power, the criminal case was simply closed. After the statute of limitations expired, with or without the bandits, interpret as desired, Akhmetov, with his leather wing, took more and more of Ukraine under his control. When you are the only one or one of the few wealthy people, the rules become practically unwritten. Let's show in this sense there is a case with the Mariupol metallurgical plant, named after Ilyich. It seems that this is one of the clear examples of a latent yet still raider seizure of the enterprise. In 2010, when the events I will talk about later took place, the metallurgical plant was among the top 3 largest metallurgical plants in Ukraine. Since 2000, Volodymyr Boyko effectively managed the enterprise, although it officially belonged to the workforce. Volodymyr Boyko's structure comprised the plant, an agro farm, stores with pharmacies, sanatoriums, and other assets. All this, as the media wrote those years, allowed the manager to create a kind of enclave for his employees with full security. But there was a problem that the plant lacked. To produce, raw materials were needed, like ore. But the company didn't have it. Akhmetov's company controlled this resource. He was an absolute monopolist in the Ukrainian market for iron ore.
Can a manufacturer have a 300% profitability? This is what our monopolies do, private monopolies. Take System Capital Management, how much it earned on raw materials last year. Our antitrust law does not work. You may notice that in Europe, someone had a 300% profitability. Tomorrow they would have taken everything away. They would have taken everything and put in jail, and we let everything slip through our fingers.
In essence, Medcombinat fell victim to exceptionally adverse circumstances, and the factory management simply had no other choice but to become part of Akhmetov's empire. And about how Akhmetov's relationship with Viktor Yanukovych's presidency, I talk about it in the blog about Yanukovych's power. In short, it benefited Akhmetov when his longtime regional friend won the election. That's why he actively invested in his political promotion. However, this is just a theory without any paper evidence. In fact, the evidence suggests otherwise. In just a year of Yanukovych's presidency, Akhmetov's assets nearly tripled, from $5.2 billion to $16 billion. Even though Rinat Leonidovich did not always get along with Fedorovich, blaming him for his life during that period would be a sin. Then the Maidan happened, followed by the occupation of part of Donbass. It appears that Akhmetov was unaffected by these events. How does the unofficial king of the region behave? In late December 2013 in Donetsk, Akhmetov, with his hands on his chest near his heart, declared,
For me, sanctions, sanctions, sanctions. For me, the biggest sanction is when I can't walk on this land, my own, in Donetsk, and I can't breathe this air with you at the same time. I am a patriot of our region.
And there is still not enough thought about what role Akhmetov played in what happened in 2014 in Donetsk and Luhansk regions. There is a theory that the billionaire was beneficial to the separatists. He allegedly wanted to use them for his own purposes, said Donetsk journalist Serhiy Harmash.
He acts as if he doesn't care, but his actions suggest that he was involved in controlled separatism.
According to the journalist, Akhmetov might have thought that this way he could protect his business empire after the change of power in Kyiv. Even then, after the Euromaidan, they were expecting sanctions from the West against the authoritarian regime. Moreover, against Akhmetov, who belonged to the closest circle of the ruling party, the former ruling party, the Regions. Publicly, Akhmetov always stated that Donbass should remain part of Ukraine. However, he hinted that the region could be granted more autonomy, a statement not uncommon. The more autonomy Donbass has, the more power and money would particularly go to Akhmetov.
No one should be particularly favored. How Donetsk and Luhansk are supposed to differ, what kind of autonomy they are supposed to have, what kind of their own parliament, what kind of their own special rights, I don't know. This is not true. Ukrainians are equal, no matter where they reside. I am from Donetsk myself. I don't understand why I would need autonomy. I lived there for 30 years. I don't know a single reason why I would need autonomy. I understand very well why autonomy might have been needed for Rinat Akhmetov, why it might have been needed for all those party regions, yes, where Nukovic, yes, Zarov and Kniev are. I do not understand. I don't understand why this is necessary for Zaharchenko, Klotnitsky, and ordinary people.
There are two versions of what format Rinat Akhmetov's communication with the separatists was. So first, he either tried to bribe them or they just took a huge amount of money and left. The media wrote that Akhmetov especially came to Donetsk to negotiate with Denis Pushilin, one of the separatist leaders. Akhmetov offered him $10 million. In response, I already heard that they were given much more, and Akhmetov can't solve anything now. Russian media, with reference to Akhmetov and Ruta, wrote that Akhmetov left the administration building where he was negotiating with the separatists in about 40 minutes and stated,
"They are absolutely inadequate. I am not an authority for them. They do not agree on any terms. I did everything I could. Well..."
Another version suggests that Akhmetov was directly financing the fighters to resist the people in Kiev. In 2014, the so-called head of the Donetsk People's Republic Ministry, Oleksandr Borodai, claimed that Akhmetov deliberately financed the Vostok battalion of fighters when it came under the control of Oleksandr Khodakovsky. Through Khodakovsky, Akhmetov allegedly tried to transfer $500,000 for the financial support of the terrorist battalion.
Because he was sitting on financing from Rinat Akhmetov. At that time, he also tried to bring me, specifically from Rinat, a bag with $500,000 with $500,000. The bag containing $500,000 was returned to Khodakovsky, who seemingly used the funds to finance the Vostok battalion. Well, how he spent it, I don't know. I can't say anything here. Well, he just sat on Akhmetov's money.
In 2016, the commander of the terrorist battalion Vostok, Oleksandr Khodakovsky, stated that behind all the processes in the Donetsk People's Republic stands the protege of oligarch Rinat Akhmetov, Maxim Leshenko. According to the fighter, nominally, Leshenko managed to seat the current puppet leader of the Donetsk People's Republic administration, Alexander Zakharchenko. However, the latter did not make significant decisions about managing the occupied territory without Leshenko's approval. There was no evidence to support these claims. However, it should not be forgotten that after the start of the military actions in Donbass, the enterprises of Rinat Akhmetov continued to operate in the occupied territory. The head of the Economic Committee of Ukraine, Andriy Novak, explained this in 2017 by the fact that there are agreements between Akhmetov and the Russian authorities.
Obviously, he made an agreement with the authorities in the Kremlin so that they would not interfere with the work of his enterprises. Of course, this was not for free. Obviously, he is paying a fee for his enterprises not being nationalized by the Donetsk People's Republic and Luhansk People's Republic groups, and for them to operate in the state regime, obviously without a certain share of financing in the so-called budgets of the Donetsk People's Republic and Luhansk People's Republic, as well as in the Russian budget. The enterprises of the richest oligarch in Ukraine would simply not be able to operate. Obviously, he is just sharing a part of the earned money.
So in fact, the money from Akhmetov's enterprises filled not only the budgets of the so-called republics and the pockets of their leaders, but also went to the Kremlin's coffers. And there are still discussions about what the future of Donbass would be like if Akhmetov sat in the governor's chair of Donetsk, as the central government proposed to him, and did what Kolomoisky did in Dnipropetrovsk. Former Secretary of the National Security and Defense Council, Alexander Turchinov, said he asked for help, both financially and in terms of Russian fighters coming to the east. Because at that time, the parliamentary coalition proposed to use authoritative businessmen to quickly restore order in the regions. Since Akhmetov used his serious authority in the region and had thousands of Donbass miners' fans who could be used to restore order, his potential help was considered important.
As for Rinat Akhmetov, he said he was not ready to do this because he loves Donetsk very much. He believes they are misguided, and he will not allow blood of his countrymen on his hands. This was his clear position. I explained that there could be significantly more blood if the infection is not localized, if the infection is not contained. But he took a firm position that I would not be involved in suppressing these people because they are simply deceived, they are misinformed.
There is a thought that Akhmetov until the end considered the escalation of the conflict a bluff on the part of Russia. Speaking the Kremlin scares everyone and then turns everything back as it was, but with certain actions for itself. As we already know, everything turned out not so. After Russia occupied part of Donbass and Akhmetov lost some of his businesses, the billionaire had to think about how to manage the situation, save capital, and maintain influence. Also in 2016, Ukrainians heard about the so-called Rotterdam Plus. This is a corruption scheme that is a source of super profits for energy producers. Many experts and politicians have stated that Rotterdam Plus is primarily beneficial to the main player in the market, the DTEK company. 80% of heat generation and 90% of coal production in Ukraine belong to Rinat Akhmetov's group. How did the Rotterdam Plus formula work? This formula determined how much we pay for electricity. Since the war in Donbass began, most anthracite coal mines that Ukrainian thermal power plants rely on have been in occupied territories, making it crucial to ensure the stability of Ukraine's energy system. Coal is the primary fuel for thermal power and combined heat and power plants in Ukraine. Either energy-generating companies could buy coal from behind the front line at the risk of supporting the occupied territories, or they decided to raise it to the world level. Therefore, the tariff included the cost of coal at the international exchange in the port of Rotterdam, where fuel is supplied from Africa and South America. They also included the cost of delivery to Ukraine, hence the name Rotterdam Plus, delivery. In short, Rotterdam Plus. It was supposed to be as beneficial as possible, but there was a nuance. After the formula was introduced, the tariff increased by 40% for the population and business. The fuel arrived at Ukrainian power plants at prices as if delivered from Rotterdam. In fact, most of the coal was supplied from Donbass and Russia, as it had been previously.
DTEK bought coal for 600 hryvnias per ton in bulk, and here they sold it for 1,700 via Rotterdam. 200% profit. Only in 2016, after the introduction of the Rotterdam Plus, DTEK made an additional 10 billion hryvnias on tariffs.
So consumers had to pay for expenses that actually didn't exist, which contradicted the law. Thanks to Rotterdam Plus, DTEK earned $1 billion over 4 years. The formula took effect in July 2019. The Rotterdam Plus issue became a major field of battle between state interests and the oligarchs' wealth. Experts from the Anti-Corruption Center clarified that the scheme with the implementation of the Rotterdam Plus formula was needed as a cover for the embezzlement of loans that increased after 2014. Such expenses in a rather clumsy way affected the consumers' market. Journalists and experts repeatedly pointed out that the scheme benefited those whom Akhmetov and former President Petro Poroshenko were particularly concerned about. However, finding evidence of such an agreement is challenging given the level of protection and the status of the former president and billionaire. When asked about the Rotterdam Plus scheme, it was necessary not only to identify those involved in its implementation, but also to identify the losses. The first expert conclusions only appeared after 2019, and when they were finally published, it turned out that different experts give different assessments. And since the final amount of losses was not confirmed, the defense argued that it was not proven that any harm was caused as a result of the formula being adopted. Prosecutor Denis Demkiv said he's not ready to go to court with superfluous expertises. During the investigation, National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine gathered important evidence to confirm that the appearance of the Rotterdam Plus formula was the result of a deliberate action by TTEK. To the point, a crucial moment. Former head of the National Commission for Energy and Utilities Regulation, Vovik, called including transportation costs in the tariff complete nonsense even before the formula was confirmed. He stated that this would mean the entire country would have to pay off the oligarchs' loans. But at the beginning of 2016, Vovk himself started pushing the formula at the meetings of the National Commission. Then the experts from the Anti-Corruption Center said,
Filing a lawsuit will give the state a good chance to recover from the implementers the damages that, according to the investigation, amount to almost 40 billion hryvnias. This is what Akhmetov fears, as well as the court over his management, because they can know more about the oligarchs' weak spots.
Akhmetov's representatives have called such allegations from the Anti-Corruption Center politicized and ones that contain obvious manipulations. Accusations from them are biased, to say the least. There is no decision or clear answers on this matter yet. Is there any criminal intent to accuse Akhmetov today? From Gokh, there is a suspicion of the statement of the current president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, in November 2021. Then he said that he has information about the state coup preparation in Ukraine. According to Zelensky, representatives of Russia and Ukraine were discussing the participation of Rinat Akhmetov in this event, supposedly so.
Received information that on the 1st, there will be a state coup in our country. We have not only agency information, but even audio information where representatives from Ukraine, so to speak, with representatives from Russia, so to speak, are discussing the participation of Rinat Akhmetov in the state coup in Ukraine. Billions of dollars will be involved, that's for sure.
Then, to clarify the journalists whether Akhmetov is preparing for the state coup Zelensky stated that Rinat Akhmetov represents, he added that Akhmetov's close examination draws him into this war, which will be his great mistake. Akhmetov's team quickly spread these statements. And in principle, they were not really forgotten about, even in the harsh 2022, a full-scale war began. Akhmetov's business, due to its spread, was hardly affected. Take, for example, the Medkombinat Ilyich and Azovstal in Mariupol. And despite this, he remains the richest person in Ukraine.
The territory of our state needs to be made safe.
Guarantor said Guarantor did. Which Guarantor? Viktor Yanukovych is a figure in the history of modern Ukraine who has easily surpassed any serious criminal authority in terms of the severity of crimes. And all because his crimes were not just local, but on a national scale. Like Yanukovych, as well as many other criminals, started small. The former president of Ukraine has had 2 convictions since the late 60s. He received one of them when he was just 17 years old. On December 15, 1967, Viktor Yanukovych was first sentenced to 3 years of imprisonment for participating in a robbery. The court established that he was part of a group of hooligans who attacked a person, beat them, and took a watch and some package from the victim. For this, young Yanukovych ended up in a juvenile colony in Kremenchuk, as he was a minor. However, he didn't complete his full term. The court reduced his sentence on the 50th anniversary of the October Revolution. He only had to serve a year and a half. And yet, for good behavior and cooperation with the colony administration, he was released even earlier. Even then, Yanukovych was a member of the notorious Pivnich gang. The gang got its name in honor of the village under the city of Yenakiv, where the gang members used to hang out. People familiar with the place and members of the group described the participants in the district like this. We
were the most visible. We ruled everywhere. Everyone was afraid of this district. There was a king there, there were huts for disputes, hats were stolen there, and...
This is where Lydia Bragina, Yanukovych's classmate, used to hang out.
The fights were frightening, like disputes among themselves, spanning from street to street and village to village.
And in the criminal world, being young was not necessarily a guarantee of being at the top of the gang. Journalists who tried to investigate his biography said that Yanukovych was considered a thug in the criminal world. He served some criminal groups in Yanakievo, but as a merchant. Before becoming well known in the country, Viktor Fedorovich was simply one of the many members of a criminal gang.
In Yanakievo, Viktor Fedorovich always associated with the local criminal authority ZUEM, who was effectively running the town informally. In
principle, from the point of view of the said, it is not surprising that Yanukovych did not insist on his will. Already in his 70s, he was sentenced to another 2 years, this time for inflicting bodily harm of medium severity. Indeed, there is a version that it was not just about this, but about extortion. Alexander Martinenko, who testified in another Yanukovych case, recalled how he flirted with girls in their company when he was drinking. He would grab her chest or something else. The girl was constantly trying to get away from him. But the real victim never filed a complaint. Apparently, Yanukovych made a special effort to talk to her. In short, let's say, no official or equivalent papers were submitted to the police. In the Yanukovych zone, Ham received a prize for showing his character to the entire nation. He had a quick temper and often reacted harshly, sometimes getting physical.
When he became president, his zone greeted him with this and hung banners, "Ham, come back to us."
Journalists of his time found another such person, Mykola Moskovchenko. This man claims he sat twice with Yanukovych, and he miraculously remembers what the supposed guarantee was.
We had a very serious conflict that didn't melt away. Whether on the ice or on the edge, as they say, it remained. I tried to melt it, but it didn't melt there. So it didn't catch fire. So, as if she grabbed me, she broke through.
Moskovchenko says that Yanukovych was the only one who didn't receive anything from anyone. And in the zone, when there was a riot, no one touched him, and he couldn't escape anywhere. From Moskovchenko's words, it seemed that Yanukovych was under some kind of protection, quite a powerful protection. The truth is that he was not guilty by criminal standards, as they then said with the prisoner. He personally established thousands of contacts with law enforcement, providing a strong basis for collaboration with the colony administration. Nevertheless, this played into Yanukovych's hands because he did not show mercy from his chosen side. After his release, Yanukovych's career suddenly goes uphill, and later his biography is rewritten as if not from scratch. Yanukovych becomes the ultimate victim of circumstances and judicial arbitrariness, and then the charges disappear, in principle. And why is that? So, as it turned out, the transformation from Yanukovych the villain to Yanukovych the power holder, there is a version that after Yanukovych's release from the colony, the criminal clubs became supportive of him. There he met the right people, and the acquaintances of his father and family friends also helped. So this very Lucy, who is trying for her father, all because the right people were pulling strings for him and gave him the card sharp's castle in one way or another. They also imply that Yanukovych cleared his criminal record using Komitet Государственной Безопасности connections over time. And it happened without the participation of Rinat Akhmetov, a longtime friend of Yanukovych himself, with whom he started in the ring when they were into boxing, and with whom they went through various teachings in gangs, which they joined in their youth.
Yanukovych's evil is thought to have two stages. In the first, he was aided by astronaut Beregovoy and the Komitet Государственной Безопасности to some degree. At the second stage during the independence, he was promoted by Akhmetov. This is during the Donetsk period.
Even though Akhmetov insists that he has known Yanukovych's homeland for over 20 years, they do not have a joint business. And in the statements to the press that Akhmetov always told Yanukovych, they have no business ties, but they undoubtedly share the same interests in the region they come from. You can believe in this version, you can consider the influence of other people, but the fact remains a fact. By some magical way, from an ordinary electrician, Yanukovych becomes the general director of the Donbass Trans-Remont Association, then the general director of the Donetsk Territorial Production Association of Auto Transport Donetsk Avtotrans, and nobody sees anything strange in this. His career was rapidly developing when crooked auctions were taking place in Donetsk, the culmination of which was the murder of Donetsk businessman Yevgeny Sherban. All this happened in 1996. Sherban was one of the wealthiest people in Ukraine in the early 90s. Almost 340 companies were part of Sherban's ATON corporation. His assets were estimated at $500 million, which was simply a staggering amount at that time. Sherban himself was also called the first Ukrainian oligarch. Unlike many other businessmen of the 90s, he was quite public and even held the status of a people's deputy. He also served on the executive committee of Ukraine's Liberal Party and the Verkhovna Rada's Commission on Youth, Sports and Tourism. However, the death of such a person could not go unnoticed. Moreover, the crime was extremely brutal. Yevgeny Sherbanya, his girlfriend, and several other people were killed at the Donetsk airport. The witness to the crime was the son of the deputy, Ruslan Sherban, who watched his father die. The incident occurred around noon on November 3, 1996. That day, Sherban returned from Moscow by private plane, where he had visited Josip Kobzon. Well, guess what? Since Kobzon had a significant influence in the criminal world, meeting him was quite beneficial. Anyway, two gunmen shot Sherban dead at his own doorstep. And his friends, the ship mechanic, aviator, and inspector, were killed almost instantly by the automatic gunfire from one of the attackers. The official investigation established that the attack was carried out by members of the Kushner gang, which included Russians, as well as individuals from the Donetsk and Luhansk regions. These people wanted to take over Sherbany because he had made a lot of money dishonestly and was preventing them from making money. The perpetrators of the attack were found and convicted, but the instigators, no. There was a thought that Sherbany was ordered by today's Ukrainian minister Pavlo Lazarenko and today's president Leonid Kuchma.
Leonid Kuchma and Pavlo Lazarenko were likely behind the assassination, aiming to eliminate a political rival. Because at that time, the Liberal Party of Ukraine occupied very important positions. At least 60% of the people's deputies then supported liberal ideas. The country's budget was largely written in Yevgeny Sherban's office.
Another version suggests that the murder was ordered by Lazarenko and Yulia Tymoshenko, as Sherban was forcing them to establish their order in the gas market. In the 95th and 6th years, Tymoshenko was the president of the United Energy Systems of Ukraine Corporation, and with Lazarenko's support, she effectively had a monopoly on the sale of Russian and Central Asian gas in Ukraine. But there is also a third version. According to her, representatives of the Donetsk clan wanted to take over Shcherban, namely the team of Viktor Yanukovych and Rinat Akhmetov. They reportedly attended the funeral of Yevgen Shcherban's team. Akhmetov received the economic dividends from the businessman's murder, and Yanukovych received the political ones. The fact is that in the mid-90s, an internal struggle broke out within the Donetsk clan, and the very competition between the old and new representatives of this informal group became the cause of Shcherban's murder. After his death, Yanukovych managed to become the governor of Donetsk, and Akhmetov took over a significant part of his business empire and became #1 in Donbass. However, as Akhmetov himself admits, this information is being spread, and no direct evidence that would indicate his involvement has been found. Ukrainian journalist Olga Rudenko noted that the history of Shcherban's murder has uncertain implications for the history of our state. Even in 1996, at the summit of Ukraine, an elite was formed that later came to power.
The murder created a vacuum that was filled by Rinat Akhmetov, Sergei Taruta, Viktor Yanukovych, and others. If there had been no murder, perhaps other oligarchs would have emerged in Donbass in the spring of 2014 who could have behaved differently. Maybe there wouldn't have been a spring of 2014, but this is all about the subjunctive history.
Journalist Denis Kazansky agrees with this thought.
To put it bluntly, I would blame the Donetsks, as if Shcherban had not been killed. However, one can confidently say that his death itself paved the way for the then unknown director of Donetsk Autotrans, who in 2010 became the 4th president of Ukraine and played a very significant role in the fate of his country.
Indeed, after the death of Yevgeny Shcherban, Yanukovych's political career began. He became the head of the Donetsk Regional Administration and the Donetsk region, and later the prime minister. However, there was a nuance. They were preparing Yanukovych to sit in the presidential chair. And now, with 2 convictions that he received in his youth, something had to be done. In 2004, political technologists decided to play on pity. They openly, and so that everyone could hear, reminded the convictions were real. But only to the fact that Viktor Fedorovich's grandmother raised him. Childhood was crucial, but he fell into bad company at a young age, which can happen to anyone. And they unjustly accused him, they deceived the poor guy, they gave the journalists the official version. According to her, in 1973, the Yenakievo court unjustly extinguished Yanukovych's criminal record. And in 1978, the Donetsk appellate court simply dropped these charges. How is this possible? We are only relying on hearsay. I will explain why. They said that Uncle Druzinin Fedorovich, that same Lucia, was the head of the Yenakievo court, and already in the Donetsk appellate court, his brother-in-law filed a lawsuit for him, a cosmonaut and deputy of the Supreme Soviet of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, Georgy Beregovoy. When journalists tried to find confirmation of Yanukovych's team's words, it turned out that all the materials of criminal cases, on the basis of which they once made statements about his innocence, had disappeared in some way. Indeed, in 2006, a new criminal case was launched due to the fact of falsification of court decisions about the removal of convictions from Yanukovych. But it was closed later that same year due to the absence of a crime composition. Thus, the biography of the future guarantor became crystal clear and more similar to what is worth calling a city legend. Eventually, political technologists created an image of Yanukovych as their own guy, a man of the people, a strong businessman who would not allow the working people to be oppressed. Paul Manafort, former advisor to United States presidential candidate Donald Trump, was heavily involved in this. And while the orange ones were busy with their petty games, Yanukovych managed to significantly change his image. They rebranded him and taught him how to behave in public as much as possible, apparently.
It was harder for him to express himself, let's say, than to use the power he possessed, which was quite natural for him. He survived all his life, so to speak, thanks to his father.
So what was the result? As a result, Yanukovych won the presidential election, but the country lost. I'm not Yanukovych's biographer, and I won't recount every scandal he's barely survived. I'll focus only on a few key moments to better understand why he deserves to be in this video. The rule of the Donetsk president is remembered not so much for resonant achievements as for scandals that were clearly motivated by political reasons. This is how they dealt with opponents in the political arena and ordinary citizens. They got rid of inconvenient corrupt officials, hooligans, and murderers. Kishenkov's courts judged ministers and their deputies, students, and pensioners for the regime. One of the illustrative examples is the case of the lawyer Alexander Kansedal. He became known throughout the country when he won a court case against Yanukovych in 2004. At one of the meetings, the politician accused a participant of the demonstration. He decided to resort to the services of the lawyer Kansedal. They won the case. The court ordered Yanukovych to officially apologize and pay 50,000 hryvnias to the victim. But the Yanukovych clan decided to resist and apparently to punish those who dared to stand against their figurehead. Or others didn't even think to raise their heads. Diana Kansedal's daughter described what happened to their family.
Yanukovych, having connections in 2009 with Prosecutor General Pshonka, decided to take revenge on my father. As a result, he was put in jail. During the trial, 50 witnesses were questioned, and none of them pointed or points to my father's involvement in the crime attributed to him.
The human rights activist was accused of 4 crimes: murder, fraud, forgery of documents, and kidnapping. The Kansedal case consisted of 50 volumes. However, there were simply no direct evidences that he committed the crimes. The only evidence that allowed to keep Kansedal under arrest was his confession. But this confession, according to the prisoner, was beaten out of him.
You were 40th. I was hanged by Kaidanko because of my hands and until the pipe in the basement of the Uborga's detention facility. There was a toilet. The pipe was about 6 feet 6 inches high from the floor. I was barely touching the floor with my toes. At that time, I was hit from behind with an oak stick, sliding along the left nostril between the buttock and under the knee. They hit my right leg, and I couldn't stand because my legs buckled from the pain and shock. They dunked my head in the toilet, flushing water. They attached a weight of about 88 pounds to my hands with handcuffs, forcing me to climb up the stairs and onto another floor. I had no strength left from the beatings, from other tortures and humiliations. My left arm was badly injured, and they failed to provide medical assistance. Hands, feet, ears, everything was swollen and covered in bloody bruises.
Kansedal's case had a sharp detail on the right side. On the first page of the indictment, there was a signature of today's Prosecutor General of Ukraine, Viktor Pshonka. Why did the Prosecutor General himself sign the documents of a seemingly criminal case? There are thousands of such cases all over Ukraine. Pshonka's signature appeared there because he was Yanukovych's man. And with a snap of his fingers, he easily sent Kansedal to jail. The man spent 7 years in prison.
Every court session, I see how he has aged, I see how he has changed, and how those humiliations, those tortures have affected him.
Kansedal was only released in 2016, following approval by the judges of the Kiev Court of Appeal. Or here's another example that deals with those who dared to speak out against Yanukovych. Not even to speak, but to hint at something. Perhaps someone remembers how graffiti with a face similar to Yanukovych's face appeared on the streets of Ukrainian cities with a red dot on the forehead. Now similar images are spreading with Putin's face. But in 2011 they were dedicated to the very Ukrainian president Yanukovych. Volodymyr Nekonenko and Ihor Honenko conceived and implemented an artistic protest action against the regime. The prosecution of Yanukovych's times apparently did so to throw the activists behind bars on criminal charges. They were accused of minor hooliganism. They allegedly threw packets filled with paint at residential buildings, public transport stops, and municipal property. Consequently, the activists were sentenced to prison terms of 1 to nearly 2 years, allegedly for hooliganism with particular cynicism and disrespect for society. Volodymyr Nekonenko says that this period was extremely difficult for him.
From the first day, my jaws hurt because I was constantly clenching my teeth from nerves. It was very difficult. It was so difficult that it's impossible to convey. The authorities simply gave the FAS command for those drawings that we distributed with my comrade. Lies. In 2014, Rysunkov gave me 8 months lies.
In 2014, the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine recognized Volodymyr Nekonenko as a political prisoner and released him. But after this, life probably won't be the same as ever. Even now, after the fall of the former regime, he is tormented by doubts about whether he is really innocent.
Having dealt with me in such a way, she ruined my life because now I can't get a job, I can't get a passport. I need to provide a certificate of no judgment everywhere.
The nearly 4 years during which Yanukovych stood near Crimea entered its history as a period of unprecedented plundering. He and his gang have robbed the state of approximately 500 billion hryvnias. And these are just the officially established facts. The Prosecutor General's office found multiple groups were part of Yanukovych's criminal organization. At times, according to the version of the evidence, they were led by them. One of them, this is the wing that operated under the roof of Kurchenko and Klimenko. Sergei Kurchenko, a so-called businessman, is someone to be skeptical about. The group of companies of this oligarch, under the name Gas Ukraine, made money from the sale of liquefied gas from state enterprises. Eventually, Kurchenko began to play the role of such a pawn of Yanukovych and his entourage. He began to buy up assets in various sectors of the economy. And Alexander Klimenko was the Minister of Revenue and Duties during the presidency of Viktor Yanukovych, and he really did collect revenues, although not where and not as he should have. In Donetsk and several other regions, Klimenko organized so-called programmatic subsidies. They had to provide services for the clearance of goods on the territory of Ukraine at a significantly reduced customs value. In addition, he is accused of organizing schemes to evade tax payments for large enterprises controlled by members of Yanukovych's family. Thus, Kurchenko and Klimenko turned enterprises of Donetsk, Dnipropetrovsk and other regions into so-called tax havens, from which nearly $100 million in cash were withdrawn monthly. Obviously not in the budget of Ukraine, but in the pockets of Yanukovych and other members of his gang. More money, more power, more power, more money. In essence, Yanukovych and his team of brave oligarchs have usurped power in Ukraine over the years. Activists dissatisfied with the regime were swiftly imprisoned. The media created an image of local landlords and their lackeys, simple people from the nation. The defenders were mostly silent because it's hard to say anything when you yourself are wearing a cap with Yanukovych's name on it. The only thing that the criminal clan couldn't buy were the hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians who had enough, who came out to protest, which turned into a dignity revolution. Even here, Yanukovych clearly couldn't cope. Indeed, the peak of his activity was when he created an organized crime group of state officials who acted against the Ukrainian people. I'm talking about the very physical resistance. It's about the most intense and cruel stage of the dignity revolution, when in 2014, on February 18th, 2014 and 20th, the dissatisfied were beaten with batons, legs, thrown into prisons. About those days when heavy armored vehicles were used against people, water cannons and APCs, when nearly 100 protesters were shot on the Maidan. Then they brought bodies with head, heart, neck injuries to the main square of the country. The dead were just left there. And what was Yanukovych doing at that time? Correct. He was communicating with the Federal Security Service and especially with Putin by phone. Well, after the forceful dispersal, he only intensified. Clearly, Yanukovych and his cronies were not standing with water meters in their hands especially. The snipers initiated the violence, not targeting protesters individually, but inflicting cruel punishments. Moreover, they provided their accomplices with the special police force Berkut. And in those days on the Maidan, they also ignited so-called titushki. In the center of Kyiv, they armed the people who have been tested since the 90s by Yanukovych. It was about armed criminals from the bands of criminal authorities known as Yura Enakievsky and Armen Sarkisian, who was also called the Watcher for Gorlovka in Donetsk. The patrons and the assembled bandits were given in the Kiev office of the same Yura Enakievsky, and Sarkisian came there with instructions and ammunition. They coordinated with the Ministry of Internal Affairs, controlled by Yanukovych's allies. The State Bureau of Investigations has been investigating this case for 8 years. And finally, in 2021, the investigation was completed and suspicions were announced to 10 high-ranking officials, members of the organized group under the leadership of the former president of Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych. Who are they? Members of Yanukovych's gang, who killed people at his will. Today's Defense Minister Pavlo Lebedev, Head of the Security Service of Ukraine, Oleksandr Yakimenko, Deputy Head of the Security Service of Ukraine Volodymyr Totsky, Minister of Internal Affairs Vitaly Zakharchenko, Deputy Minister of Internal Affairs Viktor Ratushniak, and also the Head of the Main Department of Internal Troops of the Ministry of Internal Affairs of Ukraine Stanislav Shulyak. As we can see, after the unsuccessful dispersal of the Maidan, Yanukovych fled and is currently hiding somewhere in Russia. The same applies to most of his entourage, especially members of the so-called family, the closest circle of oligarchs. Regrettably, Ukraine's fourth president still fails to grasp the full scope of the consequences. On January 24, 2019, the Obolonsky District Court of Kiev found ex-president Viktor Yanukovych guilty of state treason and complicity in conducting aggressive war. He was sentenced to 13 years in prison, but in absentia. Yanukovych's accomplices also did not pay for their actions and deeds. However, some have already managed to get sanctions lifted. From all this history, as muddy as it was through the open doors in Fedorovich's biography, one thing became clear. Without help from the side, Yanukovych would not have seen his time in the president's chair. And presumably, if it weren't for the money of the richest man in Donetsk in the 90s and then all of Ukraine, no one would ever call Yanukovych Viktor Fedorovich. To speak of Donetsk and not mention the name Akhmet Bragin, that's a real criminal. In fact, he is often referred to as one of the first bosses of the post-Soviet Donetsk mafia. However, Bragin was only such for some people. In the memory of many, his name is indelibly associated with the football club Shakhtar. But he gave it a second life, and Bragin literally died with his child during one of the matches right at the stadium. And Bragin, or as they also called him, Oligarch, or just Alik, was of Tatar origin. Along with his family, he lived in his childhood on the outskirts of Donetsk, near the local airport. From an early age, he was interested in sports, especially football, and also took up boxing. Under his tutelage, Yanukovych and Akhmetov began their boxing careers. There was even a version that Bragin and Akhmetov were relatives. According to her, one of Akhmetov's companies was not just called Alik Rinat Samson Kazali, which stands for Alik Rinat Samson Last. These are the full names of Akhmetov and Bragin. But whether this is true or not, no one can confirm 100%. Nevertheless, Bragin was not content with a small business. From a young age, he worked as a butcher and just traded in the market. Akhmet did not want to be a small trader for a long time. He was quite ambitious and sought to pave his way to a better life in any way possible. Bragin's style included a shiny jacket, gold chain and pricey shoes, but he still seemed like a butcher's apprentice. The Donetsk of the 80s perfectly matched his ambitions. In the mining town, fortunes were made overnight, and with them came people ready to spend those fortunes. At first glance, nothing sinister, but there's a nuance. It's the 80s in the Soviet Union. A group of like-minded people at that time, and under the leadership of Bragin, it's a regular gang which realized that you can make a lot of money quickly if you trade currency illegally and also open underground casinos and bookmaker offices. And, of course, to control the black markets. It's clear that it couldn't be done without racketeering. Rumors suggested that Bragin's courageous team was involved in black market activities and even prohibited prostitution. Buying anything for money was simply impossible, so they dumped everything in the warehouses to which Bragin had access. Despite this, there were no legal claims against Alik and his company. He only came to the police's attention twice officially. In the early 70s, he received a conditional sentence for stealing pigeons. He loved these birds so much. By the way, rushing ahead, I will say that probably Golubnik himself doubted him during one of the attacks on competitors. He looks ahead. This is a different story. And in 1974, they convicted Bragina for participating in a group beating of a minor. Indeed, they just closed the case right away. Whether it was because the boy they beat retracted his accusations, or because there was insufficient evidence, or maybe because there were no serious consequences for the beaten one. In other words, whatever the reason, Bragin did not see prison for this incident. The closest associates of Akhmet Bragin on the path to becoming a criminal authority were Anatolia Ryabin, known as Ryaba, Morozov, known as Beli, and Bogdanov, he himself Samson. Things were going so well for the gang that by the end of the 80s, it controlled not only Donetsk, but also many surrounding areas. Wait a minute, there's another tricky moment in Bragin's biography. At that time, he managed to work as a director in Donetsk store number 41. The name is unpleasant, agree, no, 41. And indeed, it was a district corner for lovers of deficit goods, and accordingly, a gold mine for the owners. Store number 41 was part of the Donetsk wholesale retail trade base Ukrtekstiltorg, which was managed by such a person as Shamil Ivanov. He was the one who could get and sell literally anything. Thousands of deficit goods, which ordinary citizens of the Union could not get anywhere, were collected at his base. Deficit goods from Ivanov's base were still being sold in store number 41. But most of them, at prices twice as high as the purchase price, were sold in the markets of the Donetsk region. This was blatant speculation, which was already a crime under Soviet law. At that time, when Bragin was the director of the store, no one else, like Rinat Akhmetov, worked there, as they said, as a gas station attendant, which in a more common language means an expediter. When speculators' activities attracted law enforcement attention, profit seekers would hide the expediter. And it seems that without any hesitation, he gave up all those involved in the scheme, including Bragin. In the middle of the night, Akats was forced to leave the police station. He almost managed to hide in Makivka, but thanks to Bragan's connections in law enforcement, he was caught. They simply warned him about the ambush waiting for him. In the network, you can find articles suggesting that Bragan was even ready to pay $40,000 just to stop the police from searching for him. These threats are currently empty. As you understand, if he had them and was ready to part with valuable papers, the profits from the dubious business were much larger. Indeed, as it happens in countries where the law is not the head, but all those ties, money and threats, people in the form of Bragan backed off, and he calmly returned to his business along with his team. Until the early 90s, there was virtually no legal aspect left in this business. At that time, the gang had classic signs of an organized criminal group and was rapidly expanding. Former athletes who had now become bodyguards were eager to join Bragan's team, card sharps, thugs. So, you didn't have to go far to see the Shahs who were just robbing in the middle of the street with their gang. The point was to guess under which of the 3 thimbles or shells the pea was hiding. What seemed like an innocent game at first ultimately led to substantial losses. Seriously, without a joke, a person could lose up to $1,000 in this gamble, just on such impulses. Such frames in criminal groups were valuable too. Bragan's peculiarity for the criminal world was that he had connections with such notorious lawmen, villains in the law, and sportsmen. Such were called criminal groups, which were made up of former boxers and wrestlers. Sportsmen did not recognize criminal concepts and chose in their favor, so to speak, a more modern and aggressive way, regardless of the existing authorities. Why Bragan communicated with the first and the others is a good question. Because if it was easy to attribute him to sportsmen from the point of view of youth interests, then he definitely was not a criminal in the eyes of the law. Based on the situation, he has a suspended sentence for pigeon theft. But it seems he never considered himself an independent act, and the right acquaintances mattered no less than a few years of imprisonment and old criminal rules. In short, everything turned out in such a way that Akhmet Bragan was the one who guaranteed the resolution of those or other super challenging moments that arose between the lawmen and sportsmen. Bragan had his own, so to speak, special brigade for such cases, which went out on special calls to resolve ambiguous issues in criminal circles. Bragan's group was more notorious for everything that came to light and caused misunderstandings. In fact, Akhmet balanced between the two sides of the criminal world, which could never agree and share power. Because of this, Bragan's gang, like his name, became increasingly notorious and feared. And they grew not only in connections, but also in businesses. But all the above mentioned was still too much for Akhmet Bragan. Bragan had good relations with Russian business structures. He, together with Akhmetov, took over the Russian coal market. They secured supplies of wine and grain to the liquor and coal factories and also engaged in the sale of production. Bragan was also involved in the oil business. Among other things, the media-shy business partner Alec Yuri Deyeduk spoke especially about this.
Who wasn't a bandit then? More or less realized people were all bandits. Bragan and Akhmetov had good relations with Russian business structures then. They took over the Russian market of coke production. HF Company was founded with Yevgeny Broyano and Akhmetov to sell petroleum products. Then they started to jointly supply raw materials from coke chemical plants to metallurgical plants. So we grew together.
In addition, at this time, Oligarch started a business partnership with Janusz Krantz. Krantz was one of the greats, a patron of those times. He came to Ukraine from Moldova and conducted his business mainly in Lugansk. Good day. But due to some misunderstandings with another entrepreneur, Krantz left Lugansk and moved to Donetsk. I just want one more version of the story. According to another version, the partnership with Krantz and Bragan did not work out because Krantz believed that a real businessman should be independent and therefore did not want to do business with anyone. However, the partnership between Bragan and Krantz may have been complex. In any case, there is information that by mid-1992, Oligarch had already established a large number of solid business connections with Donbass entrepreneurs, among whom were, in particular, Eduard Braginsky and Boris Avtsin. Braginsky, for example, was also known as Chirik, a villain in the law, and Boris Avtsin as Borya Donetsky. Both actively cooperated with Russian authorities and brought money from Moscow's underworld to Donetsk. At times, Avtsin had a significant influence on the formation of crime in Donetsk and made sure that its leaders were recognized in Russia as their own and those worth dealing with. I decided to clarify this moment so that there would be no misunderstanding about what kind of businessman Akhmet Bragan was dealing with. Chimali brought Alyuka profits and Donetsk's central market, which was managed by Bragin's current business partner, Kolesnikov. As far as I understand, this is the same Boris Kolesnikov, well known to many of you today, as a former People's Deputy of Ukraine from the Party of Regions and the owner of the Conti confectionery factory. At the same time, he expanded his influence on dozens of large enterprises in the region, including the Azovstal metallurgical plant. In short, he controlled significant financial and business interests in Donetsk. Bragin also became the head of the Lux company, which was actively privatizing enterprises in Donbass. Again, on paper, everything was legal. But was it really? It seems that the company became the perfect cover for criminal activities, and overall, the organized criminal group of Bragin was called Lux itself. Bragin himself strongly denied this, and even sued journalists who called him a mafioso, ultimately winning the case. And not so long ago. Even law enforcement agencies, who constantly raided Bragin's Luxembourg offices, couldn't find anything illegal about him. Time and again, they simply let him go. In Donetsk, Hacha Bragin's name is more closely linked to the football club Shakhtar than with crime, and for good reason. In the early 90s, he became Shakhtar's president. From then on, the team's performance started to improve. Dmitro Shutkov, former Shakhtar goalkeeper, remembers those times fondly, at least financially. We
started to fly to matches more often. Before that, when there was no money, we even had to go to matches in Bulgaria and Hungary by bus.
In addition, under the contracts of Gigoli's 6 athletes received allowances, which was quite prestigious at that time. During Bragin's presidency, Shakhtar won its first Independence Cup, the Ukrainian Cup in 1995. The life of a businessman, especially in the 90s, especially with a dubious reputation, could not go smoothly. So the money was really flowing like water, everyone was smiling at Bragin, even if they were cursing behind his back. He was afraid, and there were those who wanted to take him down. Competition in such matters does not sleep. The first attempt on Oleg's life was made back in 1988, and he was far from the peak of his success at that time. So in '88, the authorities of the rival gang went to Akhmet Bragin's building and shot at his windows several times. Indeed, it was done so openly that Bragin's attackers were quickly found by his people. This incident marked a period of insecurity for him in '88, and just 6 years later, an attack on Oleg occurred again. The incident happened in Pisky, in the Donetsk region, the same place where representatives of the criminal group known as Ryabin, Kushnir, Aliyev made an attempt on Bragin. The attack on Bragin was due to his refusal to cooperate with them in financial matters. The rival gang knew where to find him. It was known that he regularly visited the pigeon loft. Well, about the pigeons, if you haven't forgotten, Bragin was a real fan of these birds. The businessman's pigeon loft was situated on a children's base, sanatorium, part of it. This property was rented by the Bragin Lux company. Muscovites started coming to the sanatorium on a stolen car. 3 gunmen in masks simply crashed the car into the center of the city, pulled the driver out of the salon and drove off to the place of destination. And it still didn't make sense why, but the attackers opened fire earlier than planned. And this somehow allowed Akhmetov to escape. Reports vary, with some stating the gang used automatic weapons, while others claim they fired pistols with silencers. But in both versions, a combat grenade definitely figures, which was thrown at people by Bragina, who were visiting the sanatorium territory with their boss. 2 security guards for Alik Grek, who were at the luxury place, died on the spot. 4 more people received serious injuries, including the sanatorium guard, but Bragin managed to escape at that time. For someone, this case ended up being just a scare. It's strange that when they brought Bragin to the hospital to make sure he was okay, not only his people but also the police were guarding the entrance to the ward. Although I said that for the unfortunate Mr. Donetsk, the incident was nothing more than a scare, from that point on, Bragin began to worry about his safety even more. From that moment on, he moved to the former Minvugelprom hotel, now known as Lux. Private security was constantly patrolling the hotel territory, and Bragin occasionally switched from his usual car to an armored Mercedes. His bodyguards were practically never seen without him in any trip or meeting. But neither armor, cars, nor specially trained people could protect Bragin from another attack. It's important to understand that at that time, things in Donetsk became extremely restless. Different bandit groups were fighting each other for power, and Donetsk, Dnipro, and Chechen clans were competing with each other. State-level politicians were also involved in the struggle, and representatives of internal organs were playing against them or with them. In just one day in the Donetsk region, there could be 5-6 bombings and the culprits were simply not found. In Transcarpathia, similar statistics emerged within a single year. Both his enemies and his accusers knew this. Even though Bragin loves football and never misses a single match of his team, on October 15, 1995, Shakhtar played against Simferopol Tavria at the same stadium. 10 minutes before the match began, officials surrounded the stands where Bragin was to sit for his protection. Then, according to the plan, the guards informed their colleagues, "Everything is clear, Bragin can enter." At 17:06, Bragin entered the corridor that led to the other side of the stadium, where thousands of spectators were already gathered. At this time, an explosion occurred in the stands. Here's how journalist Alexander Kuczynski describes what happened.
The blast wave blew out the entrance doors and scattered human remains. Within a radius of 98 feet, there were hands, feet, and entrails. In the middle of it all lay a heart that had stopped. It's not a sight for the faint-hearted.
Right at the epicenter of the explosion was Akhmet Bragin. All that was left of him was a hand with a watch and a lighter. The match was abruptly interrupted. Ambulances, firefighters, police, and the security service of Ukraine quickly arrived at the scene. It was a grand-scale explosion. Unfortunately, it was impossible to save the deceased and injured. Among them, as expected, was Akhmet Bragin and 5 other individuals close to him, including his bodyguards. 3 other people were also injured. Moreover, an innocent waitress who was not far away at the time of the shooting was also injured. Experts and operatives concluded that the explosion was caused by a device placed in a basement ventilation shaft near the building entrance. The criminals deliberately dug there, made a hole of 40x30 size and placed a homemade explosive device in it. The innocuous-looking fan box actually held 11 pounds of plastic explosives. The criminals cemented the hole and disguised it with a wooden cover. It was almost impossible to notice. They activated the device remotely using a remote controller. 5 days after the explosion, the defense lawyers still haven't commented on anything. However, in the media, referring to the People's Deputy, whose name they did not mention, almost 4 versions of Bragin's liquidation were spread. Firstly, it was a conflict with Chechen criminal groups who tried to regain control over the Donetsk region.
Chechen mafia circles have long sought to take control of the Donetsk region. However, Bragin did everything possible to prevent this from happening. There were notable incidents, such as when he gathered the Chechens at the airport and expelled them from his territory by plane.
Another version is the conflict with the Georgian group from Makivka, with which Bragin's gang was at war. The text mentions that the clashes between the 2 groups had already resulted in multiple fatalities. The third version is a conflict with the Dnipro clan, which tried to establish its own order and accordingly people in Donbass. And the fourth, Ukrainian law enforcers took Bragin because they realized that they could not bring him to justice by legal means. In defense of this version, a mysterious speaker, among other things, he brought up an argument, the essence of which boiled down to the fact that the explosion was organized by professionals. Recently, the head of the Ministry of Internal Affairs in the Donetsk region was replaced. New people bring new approaches to executing tasks, which is quite possible. But the argument is weak. It's obvious that not only people from internal organs can professionally lay explosives. The investigation in this case lasted not 1 year. The defense lawyers claimed that the explosion was organized by a criminal group of Kushnir Ryabin, and police major Vyacheslav Sinenko was killed after the explosion, covering the retreat of one of the executors from the stadium. According to the police, Kushnir immediately proposed to organize an explosion at the stadium. In order to implement the plan, they hired a professional killer, a Russian citizen named Moskvich. Very original. Bolotsky was found out because he was consulting subordinates. However, he later recanted his words and claimed that he was coerced into confessing. Nevertheless, he received a severe sentence, which he served in a colony in Luhansk. Spoiler, in 2015, after the occupation from Russia's side, he apparently escaped, and where he is now is unknown. According to the investigation, co-defendant Sinenko did not admit guilt to the police. He claimed that they were making a scapegoat out of him. According to Sinenko's words, they wanted to plant high-ranking Donetskers on him. He even spoke with journalist Igor Alexandrov and openly told him about the corruption among the employees of the Donetsk police and prosecution. Moreover, Sinenko himself, as he claimed, was the one who detained one of Akhmetov's fighters at the time. And yet after this, Akhmetov threatened him with death. In short, Sinenko's case was considered in various courts until 2014. In early 2014, the Donetsk district court closed the case due to insufficient evidence. Over these years, the man had already received disability. His legs were paralyzed. At one of the court hearings, he said that this happened due to the severe bullying of him by the management staff of the equipment with organized crime. The case of potential murders of Akhmet Bragin was practically revealed. as only Bolotsky was identified as the direct executor. But the accomplices and instigators of the crime remain unfound, leaving a dead end to date. Bragan's ex-partner, Yuri Dyaduk, believed that someone else, possibly special services, was responsible for the murders. The Times of Leonid Kuchma.
In 1994, mass purges of businessmen began in Donbass. Bragging was common. I believe this was done by special services. There was a shooting at the textile factory and authority collapsed. 2 unmarked cars arrived with men in black glasses, white t-shirts and shorts. They took out Kalashnikov rifles, shot people, threw the rifles and left. There were 2 more cars of support. You must be foolish not to see that this is the doing of intelligence agencies.
Whoever is not standing up for the assassination of Mahatma Bragin understood one thing. Part of the business he revived and connections abroad ensured the release of Rinat Akhmetov. And Bragin himself still remains an ambiguous figure for Donetsk. For some, he is a criminal authority who imposed his own order in the city for the sake of personal power. For others, a patron of sports, a successful entrepreneur, a benefactor, and of course, the president of Shakhtar, under whom the football club received a second life. Films were made about Bragin. An international youth football tournament was named after him, which was held in Donetsk, and his name was carried by the Regional Association of Pigeon Lovers. But few wondered about Bragin's criminal past after his death. Well, they did wonder. In 2000, journalist and founder of the media Ukrainska Pravda, Georgy Gongadze, disappeared. He didn't show up at the doorstep of the apartment where he lived with his wife and children. In a few days, journalists, activists, and just concerned people took to the streets of Kiev with their demand to find Gongadze. When it became clear that the attack and murder of the journalist were most likely the reason for today's massive demonstrations under the slogan "Ukraine without Kuchma," Gongadze became a symbol of freedom of speech in Ukraine and independent journalism. And the Slavic journalist Igor Alexandrov is known to fewer people, although his professional activity is no less significant than what Gongadze was engaged in. Alexandrov's work undoubtedly annoyed and frightened some prominent politicians. Does this sound familiar to you? The same Kuchma, Akhmetov, and Yanukovych. The Alexandrov video is now open for sponsorship. And we will deal with all the rest in the next video about Frankivsk. Take care, dear ones.